Good morning, everyone. You're all here for Hebrew in Israel, and wow, what an interesting morning. So I wake up, I do my usual morning routine, and I check my social media because, people contact me and so on. And it reminded me of something really interesting, how social media is used to propagate a lot of nonsense. As a researcher, my job is to try to see as much as possible beyond people's propaganda and nonsense and words of that type. And I think one of the more interesting ones that comes up quite frequently is the question of Jews and Talmud, to such an extent that I actually saw one meme where you see Hitler standing next to Jesus, and Jesus is looking at the Talmud. He's shocked, and Hitler says, "You see why?" It has to be said that the Talmud is, though it is the foundation of Jewish law, it's not the thing that Jews follow. That's actually a very severe misconception regarding what Jews really do. And it has to be said that Jewish law is not governed by Talmudic sayings. It is somewhat based on it, but it has a much more complicated history than people really realize. Most Jewish communities did not study Talmud. It's true to this very day. And even to such an extent that there were Jews who objected to Talmud, and I'm not talking about Karaites. First of all, we have to understand that anti-Jewish propaganda and claiming Jews are vile and believe in horrible things and Satan worshippers and so on. This goes all the way back to Roman propaganda. The Romans went out of their way to attack the Jewish people because of the conflict with the Jewish people during the end of the Second Temple. And on top of that, we're talking about the problem of anti-Jewish Christian propaganda, especially when you deal with people like Tertullian and Marcion and people like that, who, by the way, themselves continued lots of pagan ideas, because Jews were objected to the idea of having statues. Jews objected to the concept of worshipping in certain ways, and then eventually some of the earliest blood libels, the Romans used to use the concept of cannibalism as a way of attacking people that they didn't like, but because Jews in the temple, in the Second Temple especially, was heavily emphasized the worship of God of Israel through sacrifices, which included blood expiation and things of that nature, and philosophers were against using blood in worship, then it became also this blood concept and connecting to Satanism eventually and so on. But in truth, all this goes back to Roman times. This has nothing to do with historical facts or real Jewish nature. Now, Jews have always had difficult people, horrible people within it. You read Josephus, very violent people and so on, but that's because Jews are just people. This sentiment of talking about Jews as if we're not human and things like that, that's all very, very old concepts. It's still summertime, lots of flies in the air. I'm waiting for someone to say, "Oh, you see, even the flies are attracted to him." Yeah, nice try. Flies are attracted to anyone. Anything carbon-based, they'll go for. And I'm sitting in the park, so it's summertime. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. It's really, really hot, so flies are everywhere. And I remember one funny thing was that someone said that if you have flies in your house, you're cursed. It means you're carbon-based, and flies just look for food and stuff like that. But in any case, what happens is eventually Judaism has to fold into itself, and the reality is that we get a double nature of Jewish history. One is the nature and history of rabbis, sages and rabbis and so on, which really only represent a very small percentage of Jews and what you call the intellectual echelon of the Jewish world. Well, 99% of Jews just lived their lives and mostly lived by whatever culture they grew up with. There were distinctive differences between Jews who lived in Anatolia, in Rome, in southern France, northern Africa, and so on. And the Talmud never really took over the Jewish world until around the 10th or 11th centuries, because what happened was that there were, I would say, rabbis who went out of their way to promote this propaganda, but for example, or promote rabbinic literature and its propaganda, even though the majority of Jews did not even care what rabbis had to say. I mean, people today respect rabbis very heavily, but that's after a very, very long process. And specifically, I would argue that rabbis are also divided into two types of groups, and people really admired rabbis who were kind of like miracle workers. And then from there, this persona of the holy man rabbi develops. But in truth, historically speaking, and even to this very day, Jews don't really follow what rabbis have to say. It's a really interesting thing. So even if you have a very big, important rabbi, you end up going to someone's house and they're like, yeah, but we do what we do. And the same is true about the Talmud. The Talmud is a collection of Jewish thought of a specific nature by specific people at a very specific line of time for several hundred years, but it does not necessarily represent the entire Jewish world. To such an extent, it has to be said that, for example, in the city of Palmyra, there were anti-rabbi people that actually led to the arrest of certain rabbis who went to visit there, because rabbis used to travel around the Jewish world and meeting Jewish communities and so on. But there were places where they objected to them severely, and one of the famous cases is the case of Palmyra, where even the queen there was anti-rabbinic, and they felt that rabbis got in the way of everyday Jewish life. So this is a really, really interesting thing. And the reality is that even today, people respect rabbis as leaders, as elders, and so on. But really, in truth, most communities, and this is, by the way, it does appear in Talmudic literature, most communities operate off of the assumption that you have elders in your communities. So sometimes, even if a rabbi says something, if an elder disagrees with him, he will be pushed out, or his opinion will be completely rejected. I mean, today, for example, we go to the U.S., rabbis sit on boards, but at the end of the day, the rabbi doesn't really make the decision for everyone. It's actually a community decision. So in antiquity, they actually had this concept of the 10 elders of the town, and one of them may be a rabbi, even though many communities do not have rabbis, and they would sometimes make decisions, and the rabbi would be one voice out of several. Even the term rabbi, is a term which is actually taken from Semitic languages that means great one. To become a rabbi, you can't just have an opinion and be versed in the Talmud. You also have to be a great person and an elder. And this is why it has to be stated that rabbis do not control the Jewish world completely. It's only if people accept their authority. Talmud has never really been perceived as being the authority. And there'll be people who would disagree with me, Orthodox Jews would disagree with me, but this is a historical fact. Even today, when people study Talmud, it's done more for the sake of like philosophical discussion more than anything else. No one actually really follows the Talmud to that extent, to the point where it actually has to be said that in, for example, the 10th century, 10th and 11th centuries, we find rabbis who will ask questions about the Talmud, like, for example, Rav Haigaon, and he says, oh yeah, well, they said that, but we can't accept it because we know factually this is not true. Specifically, medicines mentioned in the Talmud, practices mentioned in the Talmud that now we know are not real, or even back then they knew were not real. So that's the thing, that the treatment of the Talmud within Jewish circles was based on the idea that this is just human opinion and you can reject it, you can object to it quite clearly. And therefore, when people make the argument, oh, Jews follow the Talmud, actually no, most Jews are much more aware of the Pentateuch and the Tanakh than anything else. To such an extent where, even religious Jews would have more discussions about verses and the weekly Torah portion than what was the latest thing they read in the Talmud. I mean, I once sat down at a bus stop and this older man sits next to me and he starts asking me questions about verses, and then the final conclusion he says, because he quotes the blessings of Abraham to Isaac, the blessings to Isaac via Abraham, and then Isaac to his son, Yitzchak to Yaakov, and then he quotes from the book of Deuteronomy, from Sefer Devarim, and then he says to me at the end, and the main point is to be loyal to Torah and keep the covenant with Hashem. That's the type of discussion I got. Sure, you have, as Levine put it, Hanashka, Gedalyahu, Alon, they put it, that the rabbis really always consisted of a very, very thin crust in the upper echelon of Jewish philosophy. But in truth, communities never governed themselves that way. And even one of the more interesting things that I actually heard from my father in the last conversations I had with him before he passed away, was that he actually said, in our communities, which means the Sephardic Mediterranean communities, we didn't even use the term rabbi, we use the term chacham. And when I checked it, chacham was usually a man who just grew with knowledge throughout the years to a point where he just became so knowledgeable. But most of these chachamim were people that were, when they would discuss anything, they would discuss actually discuss the concept of what the Bible say. Most of the time when people spoke to the community, as for example the Midrash Medenu Rabbeinu, also known as Midrash Tanchuma, it's all verse based. So this whole idea that Jews are Talmudic Jews, it's just historically inaccurate. Jews are defined as rabbinic Jews, but really in truth what governs most people is family practices and things they learn sometimes, and mostly studying the Tanakh. It's just historical fact. People admire the Talmud, people will quote it sometimes and so on, and you have these online rabbis who make it look like as if everyone studies Talmud. It's just not true. Even those who do, for example, go to Daf HaYomi, the daily page, at the end of the day people walk away and they just live their regular lives. So this is just to set things in their historical perspective and what really goes on in everyday life. You do find Talmuds in people's houses, but most people are completely ignorant of what it actually says. And the thing is that because it's perceived as a source that's man-made, you always find people saying, well, so what if the Talmud says that? Even great rabbis would respond saying, so what if, that's what they thought. We disagree. Rabbeinu Tam and the Baalei Tosafot, which were in Ashkenaz, actually would say, well, we reject this. Or they'll say, so what if the Talmud says this? We have a practice that's completely different. And many Jews who lived amongst non-Jews, if the relationship was good, would treat, and this is usually one of the arguments that Jews are, racist and so on. Yeah, sure, you find racist people everywhere. It's just human nature. People are xenophobes, people hate other people, it's just fact. But to argue that Jews already had bad relationships with their neighbors, no, it just depended on what the neighbors did. The neighbors were friendly, then Jews were friendly. And even to this very day, you're America, not Hasidic Jews, but Jews who don't try to segregate themselves from everyone else, have good relationships with the neighbors if the neighbors are open to have relationships. And that's just human nature. Defining people by this one parameter of, we disagree with some passages in the Talmud because the Talmud allows, certain sexual activities which are prohibited, which is, by the way, only a theoretical discussion. One of the classic ones is about people used to scorn at this, and it's true. The discussion is there, but it's not something people practice. Never was, by the way. And Judaism has always adapted itself to what's morally acceptable, and there's massive discussions of morality. So generalization of any group is not only stupidity, it fails to recognize the fact that people don't have group thinking all the time. If you decide to join a certain group and accept what a certain group says, then you have group thinking. But there's always been rebellion in every group. So it's very important to understand that, yes, if someone says something in the name of the Talmud, quotes the Talmud, and then says, I want to live like this, that's that person's decision. But I'll finish this with the following. I used to have a rabbi in Jerusalem that I once asked him about how to make decisions in halakha. And he said to me, you have to use common sense as well. And that was probably he said to me, that's the most important lesson you learn when you become a rabbi, that you can't just take a text and say, hey, this text is this, and therefore I'm going to live by that. No, you have to stop and think, is this even realistic? Just some thoughts for today. Do with it as you may. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Yeah, it rhymed. Kol tov.